Hi there. Today we will talk about another React hook called useEffect. useEffect is the second most popular React hook in React library. So, what is the use case of useEffect hook? We use useEffect hook to handle the side effects. Side effects like fetching API from backend and handling for validating rendering React application conditionally or overcome the gap of useState hooks one step behind lagging. Actually, when we validate any form validation, we know that the useEffect hook is always one step behind than the real typing. To overcome this lagging, we use the useEffect hook. So let's see useEffect hook in action. useEffect when we call the useEffect hook, we must import from React. Actually, instead of here, I can use effect. Remove this line. So useEffect hook has two components. One is callback function and another is optional. It is the dependency array. So call this function. If we save my file, I can see that when my application renders or mounted, immediately the useEffect hook invokes. That means when we use empty bracket, our useEffect hook render only one at first time. Now if I click this button, that means I am changing my state with the useState hook, and we know that useState hook re-render our DOM. So useState hook renders our DOM, but our value inside the useState callback do not modify it. I can see only two, or remove the file. I can update my state by do not modifying my useState hook. But if I remove this dependency array, I can it will show that every time my DOM will render, my output will be rendering. That means the callback or the content inside that callback must be rendering. So you can see this first time returns OK. If I click another time, I can see here is 2. If I click another time, I can see 3. That means it renders every time. But we want that only renders based on condition. For example, I have two buttons. One is a get user and another is a clear user. So if I click this button, I can see if I click this button and I have to render my DOM. For that I use the set user ID command out this line. User is equal to user. If I click this button, I can see my DOM useEffect hook renders because my DOM is rendered. If I click this button, I can see it again renders because my DOM renders, because by clicking this button useState, this button is also renders. But we want that only when this button clicks, my DOM will be rendered. For that I have to use this variable inside my array as a dependency. So if I use user ID and save my file, if I click this button, this time my useEffect hook do not renders because it do not has the dependency. It only renders when user ID changes. That means if I click this button, I can see my useEffect hook renders. That means this way I can render any application or any component conditionally. So this method is invoked as a mounted method. That means if we are now let's talk about lifecycle method before discuss useEffect hook even more further. So in React, every component has React has two ways to create components. One is a functional component, that means use function, and another is a class component. Class component has some built-in method for every renders, and function method has also some renders. But class method and function method are different than each other. So we after React 16.8 we can use functional component to manage our state, and this way functional component is lot more clear and easier than the class component, and that's the reason functional component gets lot more popular among React community. And I will only cover the lifecycle hook of a functional component. So let's understand the functional component's lifecycle. Functional component goes in this four step in the order. At first, when our component or module import, it invokes this line. That means our module render first, then then renders the component, and after that render the useLayout hook. This is another hook of React library built-in hook. So this hook renders before our DOM fully prepared, and after that in fourth step invoke the useLayout hook. So let's see that this order works or not as we discussed. For example, for that I have to create console log, give a name 1, module log, and actually it will be top and another is the bottom, and another one inside app component, but globally top level of app component. So we know that app component returns in second time, that means second step. So it will be component log, no need top or anything. And another one we use inside our useEffect hook. Remove this log, and we know that useEffect hook renders in fourth step. So put a name so that we can check out. And we need another hook called useLayout hook. useLayout hook has the same syntax as a layout hook, useEffect hook. So remove this, add this line. We know that useLayout hook renders in third time. So if I save my files, go to my log, I can see the module top and module bottom renders sequentially. So we know that the module renders fast, and actually I typing component. So actually this will be component, not module. It will be component, it will be useEffect, and it will be useLayoutEffect. If I remove my logs, now save my files, I can see that after module renders, our component renders in second step, and useEffect renders, useLayoutEffect renders in third time, means third cycle, life cycle. And when my DOM is fully prepared, my useEffect hook renders. That means we know that the useEffect hook only renders when our DOM is prepared, fully prepared or fully rendered. So remove this line. We only focus on the useLayout hook because useLayout hook actually handle three things. If we discuss the lifecycle hook of a class component, class component has three different hooks for different purpose. One is when our component mounted, and when we on every time component updated, that we use the handle by that dependency array. When we update something, we want to render this effect. That means it handles the second method, render method of class components. And another method of another use case of useLayout hook has a return function. This function is called cleanup function. When what is the use case of this function? Suppose I have a event handler. We do not handle that event handler by React element. We handle that JavaScript or any kind or any type of handler, event handler. So we want, when we remove that handler, we want remove that code from our React application. So for that we use here. Suppose it is a click handler, we will use the remove click handler here. We will see the how we can use cleanup function in our later project or later tutorial. Just focus now with useLayout. How can we use layout hook in real life scenario? So clear the console. We know that one of the most popular way use case of useLayout hook to fetch API. So let's fetch an API and see how can we face some problems and how can we overcome them or handle them. For that I have to go to JSON placeholder. It is a third-party API or third-party free API for testing. So I copy this line and remove this line from here, fetch and paste the line URL. We know that useLayout fetch function return promise. So I can handle promise two ways, either callback or sync await method. So for that let's see in callback method. Then method, we know that at first fetch API returns data response, and we must convert this response into JSON, and finally then it returns JSON data. I can pin this JSON data into my DOM. For that, for real life scenario, we do not handle data by there. I have to put this data into my state value so that I can use anywhere in my application. So for that I already create a variable called user. So set user is equal to my data. So if I save my file, let's see before log user. Actually let's get the users/1 placeholder API has some pre-built endpoint. We will discuss about the API endpoint or API in separate tutorial. So we will talk about details about the API there. So here we will only use the API so that we can consume our API in our useEffect hook. So we can see the output appears here. So how can we pin this variable inside our DOM? For that, I cannot do directly this variable, this output into my DOM, because in JSX we discussed that this tutorial we discussed that the JSX cannot handle the JSON. So we must convert this JSON into a string to render our DOM. For that, I have to use the JSON stringify method. And now I have a user. If I save my file, I can see the users appears here. Let's see in PTY. For that, PD tag, this is a HTML tag, and JSON placeholder has two more arguments. One is null and another is true. Now I can see remove the lock from here, remove. I can see my output printed nicely. So here I feed the API into a DOM by useEffect hook. So now remove this long string into a single variable. So constant URL or user URL is equal to user URL and move the data here. I can see the output is same. Why we move the data into URL, we will see them in action in a little bit later. So let's see that if we try to remove the try to use asynchronous while instead of the then method, what happens? If I remove this line, and we know that the then method return promise, so I have to wait and constant get user. Now when we use await term, that means we have to use the async method here, this function. And in my VS Code, I already enable the ESLint. I configure the ESLint in my VS Code. That's the reason when we add the asynchronous async with inside useEffect hook, it throw an error or throw warnings that says that useEffect callback are synchronous to prevent the conditions. As we discussed there, that lifecycle hook in lifecycle hook, every step or every cycle handle one by one in a sequence order. But if we try to make this useEffect into a asynchronous function, then our we know that the asynchronous function order handle asynchronously, that means in randomly, so there will be no order maintained. That is the reason this error appears. So how do we overcome this in this problem? We can remove this function. I can create a self-invoke function here and move this line in my self-invoke function and make this function as a asynchronous. Now the error is gone. It says that we do not use the useEffect hook. So let's add our get user into user state. So set user is equal to get user. We can see the output again remains same. Now what happens if we want to move if we need this function outside of our useEffect hook for our another task, like for example, I need to click this button to appear another user. So to do that, I need to move this function outside of my useEffect hook. So for that, let's remove this function outside our useEffect hook. So this time we cannot use the self invoke function. I have to use a name function. So user, now I have to invoke this user here. User, it works fine. You can see the output is remained same. Now if I as you can see, I use a URL outside of my application, but in some case if we need the URL or any variable inside our application, that what happens, let's see. Actually here I have to use my useEffect user ID. Actually I do not use the user ID yet. Let's remove this line here. Actually need to here, and instead of the hard-coded user ID, remove make them a user ID. That means every time we click this button, our state value will be changed and my user ID will be changed. So I use the JavaScript method, so I have to convert this string to template string. Now my application works. If I save my file, if I click this button, I can see my user changing because my user ID is changing by clicking this button. As here, when we click this button, this function change the user ID. It actually change by increase user ID on every click. So when we use this way, we can see there is a warning method, warning message in my ESLint. It says that useEffect has missing dependency of getUser. That means this user is missing. We have to put this user as my dependency array. So let's put that user in a dependency array and let's see what's happened. As soon as I add this getUser in my dependency array, it throw another warning. It shows that the getUser function hook changes on every time. So I have to use the useLayout callback. Let's understand what's going on. When we call any function, suppose I call this function inside this useEffect hook, and immediately I make after that I make that function as a dependency array. What's happened? This function will be called, and when this function is called, my state value is changing because every click this button, my user ID is changing. So that is the reason when I click this invoke this function, my state, my React state will be re-render, and when React state is re-render, it says that we get a dependency array of this user invoke. That means when application renders, when any component, React component renders, it redefine this function again. That means this function, and after clicking button it create another function. That means same function created twice. And why that is happening? Because my full React component is re-renders as though it is a first time. That is the reason when we click this, when it invoke this function and make the same function inside a dependency array, it renders again. That means after if invoke here, it renders, and after render complete, it get dependency array, so it invoke this function again. So it again renders, and after the render complete, it get that it has a dependency array, so it invoke it again. This way it create a loop. That means this process will continue and my application will be crashed. This is the warning message says that it changes, it move inside the useEffect hook. That means I remove my, it says changes on every renders. That means it will changes on every renders, and every renders changes, it will create that loop. So to prevent the loop, we need to use callback hook. So why we need use callback hook and what is the use of use callback hook, we will discuss deeply about use callback hook later, but for now let's understand this problem. How can we solve this problem? React has two hooks, and one is use memo and another is use callback. To these two hooks create a cache. So when we put these two variable, this function inside a use layout hook, instead of creating multiple time, it will create single one time and remain in the cache. That is the reason when we use callback hook, it will solve our problem. So how can we do that? We have to create a use callback hook. Use callback hook has same syntax as use effect hook or use layout hook. So move our file, move our function from here to inside our callback hook. Now you can see that it says that we missing the user URL. That means what we use inside here, we must use as a dependency array same way as we use in the use effect hook. So I have to use user URL. So I can see that my this error is gone, and I have to call this function actually here to get user. And when we put the get user from here, so it throw error, so I have to remove from here, or actually this one too. Use callback return a function, so we have to use make this use callback hook inside a variable. Let make the same name as I have this here. So constant get user. Now I have the get user function inside my callback function, so it do not create the loop. So it solve our loop problem. Now I have to put this user inside here, and when we have this use effect here, I also put them here because we need to call this function when we invoke this function. So I have to put the as a dependency array too, but this time it do not throw the error because this function is now inside a callback, and use callback only create once. it doesn't matter how many time my component re-renders. So if I save my, actually let's make a, actually add a event, this one. If I save my file, I can see the same output appears here. It works as expected. So this is the, actually this is the most critical or most useful example of use layout hook. In our real life scenario, we face this problem quite often. So recap our tutorial again. We use layout hook to handle API, and we can handle API conditionally by entering any value or any value in condition. So, and this is the first thing. And second thing is, when we use asynchronous task inside a callback hook, we cannot use the asynchronous useEffect hook as a asynchronous function. We must use separate function to handle the asynchronous task. And when we move our asynchronous task outside our useEffect hook, and when our application renders or our component re-renders, it create this function, function again and again. It create, actually not function, it create everything, function, variable, or whatever there is. That means it is as though it creating that component, it render that component as first time. That is the reason when we create this any variable in application, it throw errors that it create loop, because we use that function, same function, as a callback. So to prevent the continuous loop or to loop which is caused by reassigning on every rendering, we use callback hook. What does the use callback do? Use callback create a cache. What the variable or function or whatever inside them will create a cache, and that cache will do not create second time. So this way use callback hook prevent to creating multiple time, and when we when we prevent the to recreate or reassigning same function multiple time, we can prevent the loop that cause the loop of multiple reassignment. I know for new users it seems little bit complicated, but when we use useEffect hook, and if we try to inside any method and inside the hook and make that variable as a dependency array, it will create a loop. Suppose I have a user ID, for example, for simplicity, I have a user ID and set user ID. If I put the user ID here for any reason, for conditioning check, and then set the use the set user ID method inside this here ID, suppose 1, and if I put the user ID again as a dependency array here, it will create continuous loop. That this loop is creating happening by when we invoke a function and put the same function as a dependency array. To prevent this loop, we use the use callback hook. That is the simple way as I can explain. So undo this time. Okay, hopefully it explain every use case of use effect hook.